To those of you who are not from our part of the world, you might think there's no real difference between a New Zealand accent and an Australian accent. Being mistaken for an Australian is one of the most common annoyances Kiwis experience when travelling overseas. The two accents certainly do have a lot in common, but they do have a lot of differences as well.
Our accents are completely different. They're like, where's the car? And we're like, where's the car?
New Zealand's a pretty young country, and as a result, we don't really have regional accents, except for one region in the bottom of the South Island, imaginatively named Southland. Instead, there's a sort of base New Zealand accent which varies a bit depending on social backgrounds. It's hard to pin down exactly, but there's a slightly posher accent among more educated Kiwis.
This is the thing you learn about television as opposed to radio. Television is resource heavy.
That you'd probably encounter more often in the bigger cities like Auckland or Wellington. And a quote-unquote broader accent.
Yesterday in Australia, a new job in the mining sector was advertised every 6 minutes.
In more suburban and rural areas of the country, but this isn't really necessarily a hard and fast rule. There's also a fairly distinct Māori accent.
Oh, tēnā koutou. Last night up north, somebody stole a toilet seat out of the Kaikohe police station. Now the cops got nothing to go on.
Which is, of course, more common amongst Māori. But again, it's not a hard and fast rule, and sometimes you do meet non-Māori who speak with this accent. So where does this base New Zealand accent come from? Let's take a quick look at how the accent came to be. Like I said before, New Zealand's a young country, and English was first spoken here in about the early 19th century by whalers who were mostly operating out of Australia, but later set up shop around parts of New Zealand as well. As the 19th century progressed, British interest in New Zealand began to rise, and a lot of European whalers, settlers, traders, and so on were coming into New Zealand mostly through the colony of New South Wales in Australia. In fact, New Zealand was eventually included as part of the colony of New South Wales until 1840, when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed between the British Crown and various Māori tribes, and the colony of New Zealand was established.
Now, I would like to buy the beach. All right? Now, would you accept 26 muskets, 6 barrels of gunpowder, 24 axes, some beads for your women, quantity of tobacco for your men, and some glue for your children? How say you, Savage?
Haven't you got any money?
So right from the get-go in New Zealand, you can see that the English language was massively influenced by Australia. Australia continued to have a big influence on New Zealand English throughout the rest of the 19th century as more and more Australians came to New Zealand to either dig for gold, dig for gum, and dig for sheep. At certain points in the latter half of the 19th century, the majority of immigrants into New Zealand were Australian. But as New Zealand became its own self-governing colony, more and more immigrants were coming from elsewhere. The British quickly earmarked New Zealand to become a settler colony, and throughout the late 1800s, thousands of people took advantage of schemes to settle in New Zealand via the again imaginatively named New Zealand Company. Through the New Zealand Company, people could get free passage and a plot of land to work in New Zealand, provided that they worked on that land for X amount of years, and after that time period, they could keep that land. Obviously, a lot of these new settlers came from England, but around half of them in the late 1800s were from Scotland and Ireland. A lot of the Scottish decided to settle in Otago and Southland, the coldest and wettest part of New Zealand. And that might explain the regional accent down there. So gradually, there was this base of Australian English that was being changed by steady migration of folks from the British Isles, as well as contact with local Māori. I think it's interesting to note that right up until World War II, New Zealand English still had quite a lot in common with Australian English, more so than it does today. My grandparents, for example, both of them were born after World War I, and I can remember them both using a lot of slang and phrases that most people would associate with Australia. My grandfather had a habit of calling anything good corker, as in, it's a corker party. In other words, it's a good party. My grandmother would even call us silly galahs if we were acting up as kids. Galahs are a distinctly native Australian bird, and I often wondered why she would use this term, seeing as she never actually lived in Australia. After World War II is when you see or hear the New Zealand accent develop a lot more of its unique characteristics. This was a time when even more immigrants flooded into the country and started to influence the way we speak even more. You had a lot of Brits settle down in New Zealand after the war, but there was also a pretty decent number of Dutch people who came over as well. As the post-war labour shortage continued in the 1950s and 60s, large numbers of Pacific Islanders moved to New Zealand, mostly from Samoa, Tonga and Fiji. It was at around this time also that New Zealand's national identity was becoming stronger and more distinct, and as a result, the more Kiwi way of speaking was becoming more accepted and widespread in national broadcasting and the media. Up until around the late 1960s, the very British RP accent, or received pronunciation as it's known, was considered the most cultured and correct form of English by many in New Zealand society. The best example of this concept was the fact that most radio and TV announcements in New Zealand at the time were all done in the British RP accent. If you find any audio from broadcasts made in New Zealand in the 40s, 50s and 60s, you'd swear the announcers were very posh upper-class Brits.
New Zealand is 12,000 miles from Great Britain and over 1,000 miles from Australia. However, fast air links have now placed New Zealand within a few days of the world's great centres. Yet shipping is still our lifeline.
I know this was a thing in Australia as well, and I'd be interested to know what the situation was like in other Commonwealth Anglophone countries like Canada, for example. But by the 1970s, this obsession with mimicking the accents of posh private school boys from England had all but disappeared in New Zealand, and it was now okay to speak New Zealand on TV.
Hello, Tawa, and good evening, New Zealand.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We made it just.
Yes.
Yes, we did. And thanks to Vislath Cheng for the opening gag. This Milton Bradley game is on its way to you right now.
So that's a brief history of where the New Zealand accent comes from. In summary, as much as it pains a lot of New Zealanders to admit, a lot of our accent is the product of Australian migrants coming into New Zealand during our early history, and then changes via immigrants mostly from the UK and Ireland, as well as contact with local Māori and just overall time in isolation. In the next video, we'll look at some common examples of what makes modern-day New Zealand accents distinct from other accents in the English-speaking world. If you know any good examples that I should include, or if you think I missed out some important information about the New Zealand accent's history, why not leave them in the comments? Until next time, thanks for watching.